Just like to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation event. I hope everyone's had a chance to have an initial look around the exhibition. I know some people have looked around more thoroughly. We are going to allow a little bit of time in the middle actually for going around, because we think the conversation might actually trigger people wanting to look at work again before we come back and have more of a conversation with you. So it's going to be split into sort of three parts, really. I'd very much like to welcome the three artists. So Sonia Boué, who, as you know, is very much the instigator of the project and the exhibition, very much the artist sort of behind bringing all this together. Jenni Dutton and Cole. I think to begin with, Sonia's going to give a little bit of an overview of how this came together. You're much better at doing it than I am, because you're much more, up to speed on all the different nuances of the different groups. And then I've got something I'd just like to read out before we kind of start the conversation. And what I'm hoping will happen is I've got various, not in a particular sequence, but kind of questions. Sometimes they're to you individually, but sometimes just throwing out more generally. What I'm envisaging happening is that actually it will flow itself, and I'll hardly need to say anything at all. Okay, so Sonia, if you don't have time to start.
This project came about really due to an online blog which I created in 2014 when I had this extraordinary experience with my grandmother's handbag, and everything sort of flowed from that. I inherited my grandmother's handbag. It sort of suddenly brought my grandmother back into my life. I felt like the object was alive, it was vibrating, it was sort of talking to me, it was bringing back a whole host of memories. And I just got very, very intrigued by this idea of the object as a source of inspiration, as something which might have a life of its own. And I put a call out on an artist platform called Artist News and invited some artists to join me in this kind of investigation of the power of object and how we might use objects in our art practices. And one of my ideas was thinking about trying to develop a framework for thinking about that, and that hasn't really happened. But what did happen was lots of artists who felt that objects were the core part of their practice, that it's quite a self-defining sort of thing, just got involved, and I'd say, well, can we have blog posts, articles, reviews, anything that you're interested in that's about objects, can you please send it to me and I'll post it. And this went on for a few months, I think probably for 18 months. We were all very excited, we all enjoyed this, and then it sort of fizzled out and we all got busy with our own projects, and then eventually one member of the group said, well, this would make a fantastic exhibition, can we revisit it? And at this point I then sort of discovered about myself that I was autistic, and I developed a new network of artists through blogging about autism, so this all happened online. And so my idea at that point was to bring these two networks together and create an equal platform for all the artists involved. And what's kind of happened is that the autistic artists who were also part of the project started to get really interested in objects and object work. So it's been a process for all of us, and it's been a really lovely coming together of two groups of artists who actually met for the first time. A lot of them at a private view, sadly you weren't there at all, so I won't go on about that, how lovely that was. But it's kind of almost a coming together of ideas and sort of artists and processes, which has been very organic. And it's sort of, I think that's maybe why sometimes it's difficult for other people to talk about it, because it's been a very sort of slow process in a way of things unfolding and coming together.
Did the Museum Project Research, that was the name of the blog, was it?
Yes. Yeah. Do you remember how you got involved, Jenny?
Yes, you found me online.
Did I?
Yes.
I can't be sorry.
Oh God, sorry.
There's always that's a good news to say. If you haven't already turned your phones on silent, we'll have a moment doing that.
Yeah.
Well, before we kind of get more involved in that, there's just something I wanted to kind of just throw out there as that's a little bit of a part of the sort of thinking process around objects, and it's really just because it's stimulated a bit of additional thinking for me, having already become more involved through Sonia. And it's about this sort of subject-object relationship, which seems to be the kind of core part of what you're dealing with here as practitioners. And this really came from something which I wasn't really aware of, but was just talking to a young academic friend of mine. And he said, oh, do you know about thing theory? Does anyone here know about thing theory? A few people do, good. I didn't know anything about thing theory, and he'd come across it really through studying literature and thinking about things and objects in relation to, I think it was particularly in relation to Renaissance literature. But he pointed me in this direction, and it's by, it's a quote from Bill Brown in a journal called Critical Inquiry, which some of you may have come across. And if you don't mind, I'll just read this out and just kind of it got me thinking in a slightly different direction to some of what you're talking about. As they circulate through our lives, we look through objects to see what they disclose about history, society, nature, or culture above all, what they disclose about us. But we only catch a glimpse of things. We look through objects because they are codes by which our interpretive attention makes them meaningful. Because there is a discourse of objectivity that allows us to use them as facts. A thing, in contrast, can hardly function as a window. We begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us. When the drill breaks, when the car stalls, when the window gets filthy, when they flow within the circuits of production and distribution, consumption and exhibition, has been arrested, however momentarily. The story of objects asserting themselves as things, then, is the story of a changed relation to the human subject, and thus the story of how the thing really names less an object than a particular subject-object relation. And I thought that was really kind of pertinent to what your and a lot of the other artists' sort of inquiries about what's come out of your Museum of Object research. There was something you picked up on, you were just beginning the conversation with Jenny about this sort of starting point and how, because I believe you haven't met us arts practitioners previously, and it was very much through your blog. So I'd be interested to hear, both from Jenny and Dawn.
Well, for me, it was via Twitter.
Yeah.
Which I was learning about and so thrilled to discover. And Sonia and another artist and I spent a lot, sort of about 6:30 in the morning, we used to tweet, and then we used to get this great long conversation. I mean, it's so bizarre, but it's about 2 years ago, isn't it? And well, I can't remember, we even have a name for ourselves.
That I can't remember.
Yeah, look, anyway. And the thing is, I think as an artist, objects are not the core of my practice. I will admit this now. I mean, I'm here under false pretense. No. But about 4 years ago, I got very involved in another Arts Council funded project called The Nature of Mending. And my obsession, I was able to kind of use my interest in dolls, and I got attached to a museum. And I researched in their archives and found all these broken dolls. So that actually was about 6 years ago. So I worked for about 4 years working with these broken dolls, and I think that's what you picked up on in the terms of my using objects. And so it kind of developed from there. But that's how we met. And then I came to see you in Bath. Do you remember? You were doing performance and things. But so that's how I got involved, really. Because I mean, the thing is, I live in Somerset, so I'm nowhere near anybody else here. And in the wilds of Somerset, Lordy Moses, you're so excited to find somebody, yay, there's somebody out there.
I think the thing that's extraordinary is I contacted you because that's what Patrick Goodall, who made the installation, also said. And I have no recollection of this, of actually directly contacting people. I have a recollection of putting a call out, and I can see the blog post. I can see it there, the moment where I actually published this thing which said, join me.
I mean, I think I met you even before you even started the blog.
Did you? Yeah.
I think I don't know how I came to, somebody appeared as with social media, as it does, I think someone else had liked something that you'd, and then it just suddenly, it was somebody that I knew, as it was a mutual, and I can't remember who the mutual person was, had liked something of yours, and then it popped up in my feed on Facebook, I think it was. I don't think it was Twitter to start with.
In those days I had an artist page on
Yeah.
Facebook. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that it would be good to have, you had just started, I think we'd all recently started on Twitter, and you suggested, well, didn't we have a tweet meet? And I think this was before even the day, I think it was pre-Museum Project Research. I'm sure it was, because I think out of that conversation we all had on Twitter, when lots of people just joined in and we were all frantically trying to keep up with who was saying what, and I think there was about 7 or 8 people all joined in. And I think then Museum Project Research, the blog came after that. I'm sure it did, because I remember you forming and I thought, what a brilliant name for a blog. So I'm sure, yes. So we've known each other on social media for quite a long time. Yeah, and my practice is around, so I think it was because at the time I was working with my great aunt's archive, and the diary, and her diary I very much see as an object. And that was where our connection, and with the war and the conflict, so we had a connection through not just the objects but through the subject matter as well, and the personal stories and the inherited trauma that was running through the threads that were running through our family, obviously with very different reasons, but I think that kind of connection, we had a sort of dual overlap of practices, didn't we?
Very much.
I mean, sort of picking up on that, because I think one of the really interesting things about how this exhibition has, the kind of impact it's had, is even as you're installing it, you're starting to see more threads connecting the work than you'd even been aware of, even through all the conversations you'd had with artists. And it really was the first time that it sort of brought everyone together physically. A lot of people hadn't met before, and I think it's very interesting from a sort of curatorial point of view that sometimes you're thinking you could launch something just by saying, well, we want people to apply under a certain theme or something like that. But in a way, this has got other depths and layers of connection by having grown more organically, and through the sort of very personal stories, as you're saying, that sort of sense of people delving into their own personal histories, that comes through very strongly.
And I think also because the blog launched in 2014, so it's a long time to be tweeting and seeing each other's work and having these conversations. So I think the connections are quite deep, really. So it was very, it was very joyful when we when we all finally met, and that this feeling of, we did it, because it was quite a process of, keeping the idea alive for a period of time, putting an application in, these things are not straightforward. And it took a lot of, I haven't actually said thank you yet to the artists from the original blog who stayed on board when I brought a whole new load of artists in.
But also, I think what is so significant about this is that we had time. If it was 2014, I've been making this lot of work since then. And so the fact that you had so much time to develop new work, that very rarely happens, I think, in a project. You need 2 or 3 years to experiment a bit and things don't work. And I think that's what was really good about it. It's not just making a piece of work for something, you actually have time to let it grow.
And some artists that were involved at the beginning have sort of fallen at Marion and couldn't be involved in the end. And there was quite a few that are still there on the perimeters but aren't actually involved in the exhibition, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a process in many different ways.
But I think that's because that's what you've allowed. You've let that happen. You've let it kind of grow organically. You didn't have rigid ideas about where it's going to go, and that's why all this is so diverse, because of what you've let us all do. Well, not let us, but what we've done. But it is, when you've got somebody who's leading a project like this, if you feel that you've always been very accommodating about people changing their minds and doing stuff and different things, and
I think it's because the work, the project grew out of the work, not the other way around,
Yes,
didn't it?
yeah.
The idea of the project didn't come first, and then everybody just did work that fitted
Yeah.
within that theme.
Yeah.
The work was already there being produced, and then the project came out of that commonality
Yes.
with ways that we were working and things that we were thinking about. And so I think that's why as well that there was, it's enabled such a diverse work, is that we didn't pigeonhole our work.
No, it's actually drawn on people's practices,
Yes,
isn't it?
yeah, we didn't fit our work into the criteria in any way.
I think
the project fitted with us.
Did you?
Yes, I think I did. Yes, honestly, yes, I think I did. I think I
That's
made work
interesting.
to develop my work. I
Yes.
use the concept.
Yeah,
The two big
Yeah.
pieces, yeah.
The Neither Use Nor Ornament concept, or the...
Completely. I
Yeah.
mean, it couldn't have been better. I mean, I'm going to call them that now forever and ever.
So no,
Well, it picked up on stuff I was working on, so, you know, but it was...
yeah.
so yeah, I was just going to say, picking up a little bit on that sort of thread of the kind of sort of platforms you've ended up providing, Sonia, because in the sense that to begin with, you start with the sort of social media, and it may not have resulted in an exhibition. It just could have continued like that, and indeed probably will, I would imagine, from this point. We can talk a bit about that later. But you've spoken to me about how this sort of provided a platform for you to, in terms of your, not just your research for your own practice, but for your research around what other people are doing, a sense of providing in the physical space of OVADA, being very open to showing your work. Are there sort of particular things that have come out of that that have been important to you? Because it's quite a big thing to take on, not just responsibility for your own work, but for presenting other people's.
Well, I think I set out with this idea of trying to create something that was inclusive and flexible, and that was kind of my north. That was what I, if I hadn't provided circumstances in which somebody could do the work that they wanted to do in the way that they wanted to do it, then the project had failed in my views. That was kind of what I put at the very top, and I think that's influenced sort of everything that's gone on, really. And the process has been about me exploring how to lead a project in a different way. I didn't want to do a straightforward, my application to Arts Council was fairly standard in a way. There's an exhibition at the end of it, you're working with artists, you have a joint goal in mind, but I very much wanted to do something that was different in the way it was organised and run. And I think actually maybe what's happened, I'm not sure yet, because we haven't done our evaluations yet, but maybe what's happened in trying to work differently, we've created something that's a bit different. I'm not quite sure in what way, but some people who've been to see the exhibition have said that they found it unusual in some respects, and I think it may be the depth of the work. It may be that these pieces require a lot of attention. We've been saying that, so some of us have created work that's really, you need to sit down and you need to listen to it for half an hour, or you need to sort of think about the background to it. It's not straightforward. And I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sort of clutching at straws really to understand what the difference is, but I perceive for myself that there's been a difference in the reaction that I've had from artists as well. That, you can say more than I could about this as a participating artist, but that it's been quite different in some way.
It's been really interesting to watch the project grow, I suppose, from conception through to culmination of it, really, I suppose. Because as an artist, you're very rarely involved in that level right from the word go. You're very often, somebody might have gone away, as you say, applied for the Arts Council funding, and then maybe done a call out, as you say, and then you respond to it. But so I suppose to be in right from the word go and to watch the project develop and kind of very much be a part of it, because we've all played a role in some way or another in the development of the project, haven't we?
I've called on all of you in some way to contribute in the actual running of the project, and I've shared the processes so that if there's been, some issue of change of an idea, or some sort of struggle with some element of it, I've shared that, and I've also usually probably blogged it, because that's part of the culture that we're in as well, isn't it? So we communicate to each other quite often through blogs.
I mean, that's unusual in a way, because you're being very transparent about what's going on, and very upfront for admitting when things are not working as you'd like, where there's been problems, and often in the background that won't happen. It's not to say those things don't happen, but it's often not that clear.
Yeah, that's been really interesting, I think, as a part of a participating artist. I think that's been really, really great. To sort of see how things, see how it works. I mean, it's really tricky running a project like this. There's 14 of us, for goodness sake. 14 egos and 14 little biddly bobs and complications.
But this is the weird thing, is that I was actually there's always this nervous moment when you're bringing people together into a space and you're caring for their work, you're curating and you're offering them a space, and you don't know whether they're going to like the space for the work, and you don't know whether they're going to be happy with what you've done with their work. So I was quite anxious about this, and I actually sent an email out saying, oh, by the way, we've worked really hard to think about the spaces, and this, the OVADA has, it's a fantastic characterful building, but it has, some floors are bits of the floor a bit uneven.
It's very cold.
It's very cold. It may be that your piece has been put somewhere for a very good reason. You might not, each space has got, sort of a good thing and a bad thing about it. But please be assured that we've tried the best we could, and you will know why I did that. I did that because it's honest, but also because I was trying to forestall this moment where somebody might say, help, I don't like my space, or I don't want to go there. And there's been none of that. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary, and I'm wondering if this sharing of process and being very transparent about the struggles has actually meant that people feel more sympathetic and have sort of felt more, okay, I'm willing to go with that in a situation where they might not have done.
And I think it's also about managing expectations, isn't it? So that people know exactly what, want of a better word, what they're getting themselves into. It wasn't ever, nothing was secretive or, put where you're put and you'll like it for long kind of thing, which is quite often the way with some exhibitions, or you don't have any say in, because, whilst you had kind of told us all we were going to, but there was also an element of, if you really don't like it, you must say, because then we can have a rethink. That was the other bit about being accommodating. Trying to be flexible. It must have been really difficult, because whilst we'd sent you pictures of our work and you knew roughly what we were doing from our proposals, I mean, you had no idea what was going to come. And I know myself from curating shows, even if you know the dimensions of something, it can look very different in the space, and the space that you might have thought it would work in actually sometimes doesn't work when it's in the space, or it's bigger than you envisaged it, or much smaller than you envisaged it, or the colour isn't quite the same as you sort of sit it online, and, so there's all those sort of things which, you handled very, very well.
I think it's interesting, because as you indicated from early on, the geographic spread is really quite wide in this, and therefore a lot of artists weren't familiar with the space. So those of you who are sort of Oxford-based and know this space well, you'd know exactly what the situation is at OVADA, and you'd see all the sort of benefits of the quite interesting warehouse-like space, but also see that, for those people who need more of a sort of white wall, it's a different situation, and it's quite complicated to work with. I was conscious, Sonia, when you got to that point of discussion where I was having some conversations with you, how, from that sort of very democratic starting point, and then having to negotiate or fine detail of exactly how people wanted their work displayed. and again managing expectations, because as you'll all be familiar with, or those of you who are artists, that the sort of budget is often quite limited, and the time is limited, and the technical support is only around for a certain time. So you've got to there's a lot of things to kind of weigh up in terms of dealing with all of that, but at the same time not letting that overpower the actual work itself, because that's what you want to be standing out, and for people not to be aware of all the decisions that have been made in the background. So I think that was kind of quite an interesting process, but because you've had that long lead-in with artists, you were more, I got the sense that you were more familiar with who would be interested in what type of space. So, is there anything else you feel about that process?
Well, it's a really fascinating space to work with. I mean, it's a gift, really, isn't it? And it ultimately, we gave it so much thought. I worked with Hugh Pryor, who made the glass bottle installation that's through in that darker space in the lobby. And I mean, we worked on this space for months, really. Sort of thinking about all the different configurations and the different ways that the walls could work, because there's set number of walls and partitions that are available. And so it was quite interesting, actually. It's fascinating to work on, and to have Hugh to work with, who's very, very familiar with the space, because he works on a lot of the installs here. And it was just very kind of exciting in a way to actually see it come together at the end and see how the configurations worked, and then realise that you've made the right choices. But right up to the end, right the night before we actually started putting the walls in, because then you realise you can't change your mind, I was having sort of slight doubts and thinking, I'm not sure about particularly this T-shape here. But it kind of worked. I think there comes a point where you've just got to hold your nerve, and I thought, if I say to the install team, I'm changed my mind, I'm not going to be very popular. But yes, there weren't really any surprises. It was extraordinary. There weren't really any surprises. I think we'd had such good communication from all of the artists about what they were planning to do, that actually. And some of you came to install your own work as well, didn't you? You came to put your work up, and that was very quick, wasn't it, Jenni? The only bit you didn't know about was the doll's head, wasn't it?
Yeah. But then that was fine.
Yeah.
We need to wait and see.
I'd like to sort of draw things back to also this idea about objects, and how objects have been so significant for everyone in the work. And looking at it now, I mean, maybe starting with Sonia, Dawn's hardly had time to look around the exhibition, but Jenni, you're more familiar with it now as well, having been, in Oxford for longer. Are there any sort of particular kind of conversations between the work which have kind of happened, which you, to some extent, sort of unexpected? There were maybe some things which you could have anticipated happening, and you were thinking about when you were curating, but are there other things which have happened which have been
well, there was an extraordinary coincidence with Neil Armstrong is over there, Patrick Goodall's work. The reason I said Neil Armstrong is because it's about moon landings.
Yes.
But Patrick has used some IMAX cinema film that he's sort of put in the floor of his installation, and it's all about NASA moon landings. It's sort of pictures of people sitting at their at these monitors and watching moon landings happen. And then we've got Sonia Zellick's piece, which is just on the other side of the T-shape, which is a film piece that she's used all kinds of different VHS recordings and her own recordings, and some of them are of moon landings, and she's recalling her relationship with her father and the conversations that she had, and the fact that they watched these moon landings together. And they're literally just across the way from each other, and that's something that I only realised when Patrick started telling me about his piece. as he was installing the work. And I thought, oh, hang on a minute, that's extraordinary. And there have been a few other things like that. I mean, it wasn't until I read your blog post about your work that you published a little bit before the show that I began to realise exactly how similar the layers of trauma across generation that you and I are working
family.
And how that sort of working through objects has actually enabled conversations or respecting others. And how objects has that capacity to open up conversations. So those were the two kind of things that really stood out.
I think for me it was the family thing, it was the generational thing. You know, with this work and yours. I think, and my work is all about family and objects relating to one's family. So I think that was quite exciting. But I didn't pay much attention to it all before we actually came here.
Because you're so focused on the work.
Well, yes, you know, you think I don't want to know about everybody else's just yet. But no, that was a really interesting thing. And I read all your stuff and just to kind of get a sense of what was going on.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, I personally would be interested, and I suspect people here might be, if each of you could say a little bit more about that sense of how these particular objects, the Sonia exhibition and those family relationships and the sort of symbolic nature of quite a lot of the materials and the objects. I don't know whether you'd like to maybe starting with Jenny, expand a bit more on that.
I think for me, my mother was in a care home for a long time, and I completed a whole series of work called Dementia Darlings, which are the big sewings. And when she died, I think everything kind of crystallised, and I made the passport paintings because they seem to be the best sort of objects, especially with the whole Brexit thing that's going on and about our identity, and all my old passports. And the random nature of the weirdest, funny little objects that one keeps, and the importance of them that you cannot possibly explain in words. And so what I was doing with those was just giving them a bit of a highlight, and just to sort of honour them really with that project. The doll's head in this is very, very significant and deeply symbolic, and is associated with loss, regret, I think all sorts of things like that. So I think I'm only just now beginning to realise what that does represent and what that means to me. And I must be quite slow. I was talking to Sonia before. I must be quite slow in all of this, but I tend not to think about why until I've worked through something, and then allow that, because otherwise one can become quite self-conscious about why you're doing something. And you know, I'm just working quite intuitively, and you know, taking a challenge on to do something. And then I think it's only now that I'm beginning to realise what it's all about. Mainly because I thought about it quite a lot because of today, and that's actually going to inform the next work I'm going to develop, and you know, alongside from here. And also the thing is, I was one of these what they call army brats, don't they? My father was in the army, so I got shipped off to boarding school and moved all the way around the whole country and different parts of the world as a child. And I think the objects that you kind of hang on to, the random, strangest bits of object, have a hugely important quality to them, a hugely important importance. Some very sad and some not, but mostly just very, very strong. But I think that's because of my background, my upbringing.
No, it's interesting for you to be already thinking about sort of what this has done in terms of the next stage of your practice, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit more.
All sorts of random things going on. But it's kind of rather disturbing me, and what I thought was going to be my little path is kind of changing.
I was wondering, Dawn, whether you could say a little bit more, you know, in terms of, because some people may not have had time to really look or to read the really nice catalogue you've put together about the exhibition, the statements, but if you haven't had a chance to read that, just to say a bit more particular about this piece.
Yeah, so again, this piece is very much a response to my mum as well, so very connected with Jenny's work. And I've been working with my family history and family archive for good 12, 13 years now. And although this piece actually doesn't really contain any objects that are in my family archive, I very much am a collector of objects as well, and I will buy objects, which I know is again a connection between what Sonia and I do as well, because I know Sonia's a great buyer of objects as well. I'll be in a random charity shop or a second-hand shop, and something will just jump out to have some kind of significance. So I have quite a collection of empty clocks. I call them empty clocks because they're clock cases that no longer have the clock mechanism in them. Although to me they still very much speak of time. They are still timepieces in the fact of their design. They speak of a period in time, or that loss of the mechanism that actually records time. And so this slate clock on the mantel shelf here, it reminded me very much of a clock that my nana had when I was a child, and it was broken. It didn't have its mechanism. The lid was actually broken on its top, and so I bought it for that reason, because it just reminded me of my nana, and I had very little of her objects. She died when I was 16, and a lot of the objects from her home, furniture and things, were my older siblings had, because they had homes of their own and I didn't. I was still living at home with my parents. So I didn't have the means to be able to have any objects that belonged to her. So those kind of things are important, that I sometimes gain ownership of something which has a significance because it's an object that has perhaps been lost through the generations and through the giving up of homes. And so when I started, I mean, this piece of work is actually quite different from the piece that I actually originally proposed for this exhibition. And it kind of grew as I started working with the clock. And that's very much part of my practice. It's the reason I don't like writing proposals, because I know full well that what will happen in the end will have nothing to do with the original proposal. And I think I might even have put at the end of my proposal, but this could all change when I'm making the work or something, because I always need that get-out clause that you know, please don't think what I've put in this proposal is going to be anything like what gets out. So yes, so as I was beginning to work with the clock, materials are very important to me as well, and the materials that I use in my work very often have significance to the idea behind the work as well. So this piece of work came about as well through talking to my mum and her loss of her brother during the Second World War, and it would have been my nana's son. And then going back another generation, the loss of my nana lost her brother in the First World War, and so my great-grandmother would have lost her son. So it was this sort of generational thing through the generations in my family, through the women, this sense of loss. And my mum, who is now in a care home, she's very much alive, but her mental health has been affected by the loss of her brother throughout her entire life, and still is affected now. I mean, she's 90, and she still feels that sense of loss of losing her brother. So this piece is very much a response to that sense of loss. So the different materials, so the lead for me, I like dichotomies of materials, duality of meaning. So lead, it's poisonous. It was used in bullets and in the shrapnel shells during the First World War. But it's also a protector to us, so it's used to line X-ray rooms to protect the surrounding environment. It's used in nuclear bunkers to protect us from nuclear attack. So it's that kind of, that on the one hand it can be deadly to us, and on the other hand it can actually protect us. So it's a very, very much a material that I return to quite a lot in my work. And then the hand embroidered textiles. I use a lot of hand embroidered textiles, some that I've made, but some that also I've collected, because I like that history of somebody actually, again, they're a timepiece. They speak of a time when that somebody sat down and physically stitched those items. So they have a time-based element to them. they also have a personal connection to the person that made them. They have a history, they have an evidence of their history in what they are, the object that they are, but also in the actual making and creating of them, the personalising of them. They speak of a person that actually owned them. So these three materials, the actual slate clock, the lead and the textiles, the making of the other clocks just kind of came about. I can't quite articulate how it came about, because in my studio one day I thought, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to make a clock out of lead? Or let's see if I can create a clock out of two handkerchiefs. It literally was like, and let's see what happens. And so I spent, a good few weeks trying to figure out actually how to then make a clock out of some lead and a clock out of, and then not knowing what the results would be. And then, sorry, I'm talking for a long time here. The work is multi-layered, and that becomes a problem, and I know Sonia and I'm sure Jenny find that problem as well, that because the work's so multi-layered, there's no real starting point and there's no real end point, and no logical sequence to talk about it in, because it's all relevant and it's all it's all a starting point and it's all an end point, and it's knowing how to put it in some kind of order that actually makes sense when you speak the words out of your mouth. They're all in here, but so the hair that's in the lead clock, in the slate clock, that's actually another piece of work which was completely separate to this and had nothing to do with this exhibition originally. I began, I sound so mad sometimes when I say it out loud. I think, oh my God, okay. So a lot of my work is around war and conflict, and I've done a whole body of work around the First World War and my great aunt's archive, who was a VAD nurse during the First World War. And the hair work is very much linked to the centenary of the First World War. So on the centenary of the first day of the First World War, I decided I would begin collecting my hair. And the hair that's in this is actually, Sonia doesn't actually know this, I don't think. I intended to write a blog about it, and then I never got round to it. So it's a piece that's actually called Tearing My Hair Out. And I was quite interested to know that idea of when you're in a situation, again, it's linked to the mental health as well, that idea of when you're in that term, tearing your hair out, and what that embodies in those words of tearing your hair out, and how people during the festival must have felt that they were tearing their hair out, and how when you're in a state of anxiety, it's a term that we often use, of tearing your hair out. And so I wanted to somehow visualise with myself how much hair loss you would have over a period of the First World War. So I began. My husband's sitting there going, yeah, I live with this. So on the first day of the centenary of the First World War, I began collecting my hair. But it is hair that I've literally torn out. So it was hair that was collected in my hairbrush as I styled my hair every day. So it wasn't hair that fell out naturally, it was hair that I had literally torn from my head. And then on the last day, on the centenary of the last day of the First World War, I stopped collecting it. So this is some of the hair that I collected as part of, so it's actually an entirely different piece of work. But it felt somehow, when I was making these clocks, that slate clock, it just felt it was the right place to put it. For the reason that I began to see the clock as a memento mori, as a piece of work which talked about my mortality, my mum's mortality, the loss of my uncle and my great-uncle. And actually then links to photographs, because on the far left-hand side here is my great-grandmother, who I never knew. But and next to her is her son, so my great-uncle William. And both men who died are both called William. She's actually wearing a Mori brooch, so she's actually wearing the image of her son, who's the photograph next to her, a cutout of him in her pendant. And so I sort of felt I wanted to represent somehow that Victorian sense of mourning in the Victorian clock, And so some of the hair work ended up going into the blog quite unintentionally in a way, because it wasn't ever, that's not what the hair work was for, and it was never going to be part of this, and it only really happened in about 2 weeks prior to the work being finished, ready to be shipped here. It just all of a sudden felt like it was the right thing to do. So kind of two projects in the end collided.
I recognise that's happened to me also. For a piece that I'm sending off to, I can't remember where now, but I'm sending a piece of work off which has actually incorporated the piece from 2014.
Yeah.
It just suddenly feels right to pull those together. So I totally recognise that. Yeah.
And that moves on quite nicely, Sonia, to you saying a little bit more about the sort of objects within, because obviously it's through your research about your own work that brought the group together. But
yeah, I mean, my piece similarly, I lived with my piece throughout the project, the whole project. So the cabinet that's around the corner there, I found a very, very light dawn. I found, I'm constantly trawling for items, and I found this cabinet right at the beginning of having successfully applied for this Arts Council money and getting the yes through. I suddenly realised that I was going to have to do an awful lot of project management, and I was a bit anxious about this. How was I going to get into my studio? And I thought, well, okay, I found this cabinet, I'm going to put it in my home next to my desk, and I'm going to have my creative piece and my project management piece living next to each other, so that when my brain sort of suddenly can't cope with, some desk work, which happens very regularly during the day, my brain is kind of like a bit all over the place, I'll be able to focus and I won't forget. I've needed a visual reminder of my piece. And so what my piece became, it was meant to be a portrait of my father. I work very much with my father's memory and the history of the Spanish Civil War, and our lives as a family where essentially my father was in exile, political exile. I didn't know about this. This was sort of a hidden history, if you like. And so I'd originally thought about making a portrait, and I thought, okay, well, I'll fill this cabinet with objects which relate to that history, which are about shared domestic space. And the project sort of became filling up the cabinet with items, documenting. I got incredibly interested in photography, and I stopped relying on my iPhone and started using what I would call a proper camera, in a very amateur fashion, because I'm not a photographer, but I was suddenly fascinated by this process of documenting the life of the objects, the life inside the cabinet, the changes, the things which felt right together, the things which didn't. As I moved things around, that became the piece. But I had also decided that I wanted to work with sound for my piece as well, so I had to sort of think about how I would incorporate that into this piece. And the idea of a suitcase telephone sort of emerged one day by complete accident. One of those things where you're sat at your desk. I think I just bought a gorgeous little suitcase. I had this vintage telephone that I've been messing around with, and I suddenly just put one on top of the other, and I thought, oh, I really like that. Took a photo, put it on Instagram, and got 1 million likes, well, not 1 million, but loads of likes. And I thought, oh. And then I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could actually put some sound into that? And this would be like dialing the past. And it just sort of, I thought, oh, but that's not something I can do because I'm not very technical. But somebody who'd seen the image, and one of the artists at the studios, Tom Mills, said to me, I know that'd be easy to do. That'd be really easy. And it was with that encouragement that I thought, okay, well. And then I realised that the sound piece that I wanted to work on is a short excerpt from a play that I wrote, very strangely. I'm not a playwright. As you say, we're a bit crazy. Just all of a sudden I decided that the way to relate to my father, who was a playwright, was to write a play, because that's where I encountered him his voice was very alive in a way that it hadn't been in his lifetime, because he was very also affected by mental ill health due to his status as an exile and sort of trauma that he'd gone through as a very young man. So I thought, okay, well, what I want to do is I want to get this excerpt of this play inside this suitcase and get it so that you can listen to it on his telephone. And that's what I did. So that's kind of how it evolved very organically. And then I, sort of like about a week into the exhibition, I put that chair, that Danish chair, which I got for £10, I'm very proud of it. Got it for £10 in a charity shop. And I hadn't wanted to put it there because it's Danish and it's not Spanish. But ultimately I realised that people would want to sit and listen if they were going to listen to this piece, and actually it fits perfectly with the piece, because it's just part of mine. It's been sitting with me at home with all the other pieces, and in a way I could have brought any number of pieces together and put them there, and as you know, Sarah, I brought a lot of pieces in which I tried putting in and they didn't make it. So it's been like a real process of building up over a period of time and editing. And there were also times where I thought I might show my photographs, that might be the piece, the documentation might be the piece. So it's sort of like this constant. And I kept sort of saying on social media in the build-up to this exhibition, I don't know whether this piece is going to land or not in this cabinet, what is going to be in this cabinet, you know, it's sort of even unknown to me. So I think it has been quite spontaneous in some ways.
Yeah. And you've spoken to me and other people as well, but very much about seeing objects as a kind of language, and you're finding that through this project, that's it's really reinforcing that in terms of the way we read them. I mean, a lot of that must be quite culturally specific. Because if you go to different places and obviously in different times, objects you would have read them in different ways. They would have different associations. But it's interesting that this exhibition brought together, quite a few people of a similar generation. It's a few years in it, but it's kind of, there was a similarity. Because as we were installing the work, we suddenly realised that there's two cabinets that are almost like they're of the same era. And as we were sort of putting them in place and thinking, we kept looking at how they're constructed and thinking they're almost made in the same factory.
Absolutely.
And that was just by chance, and they've probably both been bought in charity shops, but particularly to show particular kinds of objects. So it's another of those nice little coincidences. But it's probably not as coincidental as you imagine. It's maybe the particular group of people who've gravitated towards your project. People who are thinking in a similar way, and may have some resonance to some of the kind of artists in the audience as well. What we were wanting to do actually is part way through. We're about kind of roughly halfway through the time we have, and we thought it would be quite a good idea just for people to kind of be able to stretch their legs a bit. And before, I know sometimes we sort of throw questions out and everyone's thinking, I haven't thought of anything yet. And what we'd quite like to do is maybe just have, how long do you think, Sonia? About 15 minutes? We definitely don't want to lose people, so you're not allowed to leave. Sorry. It's not over. But what we'd like you to do is, in light of the conversation we've had so far, is to go around the exhibition, maybe look at work that you haven't seen before in any detail. I certainly found, even though I was quite involved in it all, I needed to listen to some of the video pieces more, watch in more detail, and then literally back to the seats that you're in. So we say about 15 minutes. Does that seem about right? And then, if everyone would like to come back, if you've got any kind of key questions, things that this has sort of triggered for you to it's not a huge group, hopefully not intimidating. We'd very much like to have a dialogue with you as well. So it just gives you a chance to think of a few things you might like to ask. Is that okay? Right. I'm stretching my legs a bit as well.
Let's go into the top correspondence.
Oh, right. No, I didn't think of that.